I've had the opportunity to see much of the world and work in the world of asbestos for some 5 decades now. This is, I think, my first time in giving a talk in the Netherlands. And I now have a connection here because I've been working with the Center for Expertise on Asbestos and Fibers, which started a while back, and I serve as a medical advisor. My background is as an occupational physician, having studied with Dr. Irving Sulikoff, a name that many of you will know, who did pioneering work in the 1960s regarding asbestos. So what I'd like to do with you this morning is sort of take you on a little bit of a trip and talk about the truth about asbestos disease. My understanding is, not only in America, where we have a president who claims that asbestos is a Chinese hoax, we have others elsewhere who do not recognize that there is a serious problem in being exposed to asbestos. So let us go through some understandings that I have learned and that I can share with you this morning. So again, I'm sure all of you know what asbestos is. It is a term that is a commercial term coming from the Greek unquenchable. Asbestos is 6 naturally occurring mineral fibers coming in 2 families. The serpentine form, which is chrysotile, about 95% of all the world's use of asbestos was chrysotile. And then the 5 amphiboles, only 2 of which were ever really commercially important. We have here a picture of an autopsy done in the year 1899. There's an asbestos body there. It's a little hard to see on the right. It's covered up with some other tissue. But a young man who had gone to work at an asbestos textile factory in London told his physician, Dr. Montague Murray, that he was one of 10 young men who had started 10 years earlier, and he was the 10th and last to die, all of them having died of respiratory insufficiency. So at his autopsy, Montague Murray found this bit of tissue and called it a curious body. It didn't get the name asbestos body for some years later. In terms of asbestos use, even though there are many countries that have banned the use of asbestos, still about 2 million tons a year are being used. Half of it comes from Russia, primarily Asbest Russia. There's also Asbestos Quebec, where the mines are now closed. And where is it used? 50% of all the asbestos used in the world comes from 2 countries, China and India, both the countries that I've done asbestos-related work in, and then other countries that continue to use significant amounts of asbestos. In the past, the World Health Organization has estimated 107,000 yearly deaths from asbestos. We're going to hear from Professor Takala later this morning. He will have some newer and more striking and more upsetting figures. The number is really quite a bit higher. So, more than 60 countries have now totally banned the use of asbestos. That includes countries where asbestos mining was still ongoing. Brazil was the first country to ban asbestos use after the Supreme Court there ruled. It was the first country to do so that had an active mine. Colombia in South America has recently done that as well. However, as I stand here, my home country, the United States, is not one of those countries. And hopefully at some point we can catch up with the rest of the reasonable world. Now, the question that might be raised is, does stopping the use of asbestos stop disease? And the answer is clearly yes. Those data come from Sweden. They were the second country after Iceland to ban asbestos about 30 years ago. And if you look at the rates of mesothelioma, well, they still have some. One of the things we know about mesothelioma, it has a very long tail in terms of exposure to the development of disease. And they have shown that the rates of developing mesotheliomas have gone down greatly once they stop the use of asbestos. So the other thing we know is that some countries are very poor in terms of their data collection. The Russians, for example, have decided they will no longer separately code mesotheliomas. So now they claim they don't have any mesotheliomas. I've done work in India, where until very recently there had never been a recorded case of mesothelioma, yet in 1 year, about 5 years ago, I was speaking to a physician who said they had 32 cases of mesothelioma in one cancer hospital, none of which had been recorded by the official government agency. India is a place that uses a lot of asbestos. Very powerful people run the asbestos cement industry, which is where it is used. And so we have a problem there. But what we have learned in public health is the absence of data does not mean the absence of disease. So keep that in mind. There are legitimate areas of controversy with regard to the science of asbestos. In addition to my clinical work, I've done some basic laboratory studies, cell culture, organ study, and animal study. And we still have issues about relative toxicity of various fibers. Fiber size is an issue. Synergy between fibers and with other materials is still a legitimate scientific issue. That said, there are a number of contrived controversies. We have the so-called safety of chrysotile. I'll show you some data which convinced me and should have convinced everybody that there is no such thing as a safe form of asbestos. Biopersistence is, again, a red herring that has come out. People have claimed that, well, chrysotile doesn't biopersist in the lung, therefore it doesn't cause disease. Well, there might be a reason for that. It happens to go out to the pleura. In studies of tissue where people have looked in the pleura at cases of mesothelioma, in some studies, more than one, up to 80% of the finding of fibers in the pleura are actually of chrysotile. So it leaves the lung. The fluid pressures actually move chrysotile much more easily out to the periphery. And so many mesotheliomas are found with chrysotile as the only fiber in the tissue. The other point is that people say that fibers less than 5 microns don't cause disease. Again, that's sort of a fallacy. The 5-micron rule came about because of microscopy. Perhaps my colleague Sean Fitzgerald will address that later. But we know that the majority of chrysotile fibers in the pleura in cases of mesothelioma are short chrysotile fibers. There's the fallacy of controlled use. When I work in India, they say, well, we control the use of asbestos. I don't have pictures from there. I got some from other places. But there is no such thing as controlled use. And even in a country like Canada, where they studied controlled use, 9 out of 10 work sites that were studied by a government agency found that so-called controlled use didn't exist. So in a country that has the resources to do this and the regulations, that is also a fallacy. And lastly, I've had to deal with the issue in places like India where they say we have genetic variability. Indians are not the same as Western Europeans and Americans. They don't get mesotheliomas. Till I point out that 99.999% of our genes are all the same, and there are plenty of mesotheliomas in India, just not recorded. So Dr. Montague Murray, in 1906, after having done the autopsy in 1899, wrote, "One hears, generally speaking, that considerable trouble is now taken to prevent the inhalation of dust, and so the disease is not so likely to occur as heretofore." So the idea that the knowledge about asbestos is new is also a bit of a fallacy, because it was well appreciated in 1906, and in fact in 1898 there had been Her Majesty's Inspectorate of Factories report talking about asbestos disease in Great Britain. So as we stand here in 2019, this is the spectrum of asbestos disease. We have 2 families of disease. We have the non-malignant diseases, asbestos warts. It gets into the skin, causes a wart-like growth. Not a major problem, not very common. I haven't seen very many of those in my career. We have benign asbestotic pleural effusions. Scares the heck out of clinicians because it's a bloody fluid in the chest. You think there's a cancer. You look and you look and you can't find the cancer. But it is a benign effusion from irritation of the pleura. And then, of course, you have asbestosis, both parenchymal, the lung tissue itself, and the lining of the chest wall and outside the lungs, the pleura, and so you get scarring, much like other dust. So if you think of coal workers' pneumoconiosis, or if you think of silicosis, asbestosis is in that family of diseases. What makes asbestos such a real problem? Well, there are many things that cause cancer. Not many things cause as many cancers as does asbestos. We have lung cancer, which is the most common cancer related to exposure to asbestos. Mesothelioma, both of the pleura and the peritoneum, as well as the pericardium, the sac around the heart, and the testicular mesotheliomas in males. Again, those latter two are very uncommon, but they do occur. We have gastrointestinal cancers, the esophagus, stomach, colorectal cancers, laryngeal cancer, the voice box, oropharyngeal cancer, other cancers in the mouth area, kidney cancer, and in women, ovarian cancer, all related to exposure to asbestos. Not many things cause this large number of cancers. For those of you that perhaps haven't appreciated how asbestos is mined, that's the town of Asbestos, Quebec. It's a big open pit mine, and that's how they would extract asbestos from the earth. Now, can asbestos fibers be identified? I'm going to leave it to Sean Fitzgerald, who follows me, to go in much greater detail. But you can do polarizing light microscopy. You can do scanning electron microscopy. This is a single chrysotile fiber with the small fibrils coming off that single fiber. Transmission electron microscopy, and then you can do fingerprinting with electron diffraction or X-ray diffraction and fingerprint a particular fiber. Now here is a better looking, clearer asbestos body. It's a fiber that's been coated with iron and protein. It is in every one of us in this room, asbestos being a natural material. It's in the air. I'm sure it's in the air of the Netherlands, just as it is pretty much everywhere in the world. They can find it in the ice caps of the Arctic. When they've done the ice cores, they see very little years ago, but after about 1880, when asbestos started being mined, you can follow the increasing use by how much was deposited in the ice in the Arctic. For every one of these coated fibers, there are probably hundreds, if not thousands, of uncoated fibers that exist in everyone's lung. This is what a fibrosis-looking lung, or fibrotic-looking lung would look like. It should be thin and lacy, allowing oxygen to easily transfer from the lung into the bloodstream. What happens is you get thickened tissue, and that's what makes it hard to transfer the oxygen, giving rise in severe cases to people who are extraordinarily short of breath, to the point where they either need to be on oxygen, or if they have to negotiate a flight of stairs, workers are known to take a long period of time, sometimes sitting on each step as they go up, pushing themselves up, sitting on a step to catch their breath before they go to the next step, or become somewhat thin and emaciated because they can't close their mouth long enough to chew their food without getting short of breath. Radiologically, this is what an asbestotic X-ray might look like. And this white rind around this lung is that of a chrysotile miner from Canada. He had come to the hospital that I trained at, Mount Sinai, where I studied with Professor Selikoff. That is a thickened pleura that is pleural asbestosis. Some now use the term asbestos-related pleural disease. I don't care what you call it, but it can affect the pleura as well as the lung. He came to our hospital, had a decortication or removal of the thickened material on one side, was getting ready for his surgery on the other side. Unfortunately, he developed pneumonia. Hospitals are not good places to be. Even if you're well, but if you're sick, you end up getting other diseases, and he passed away, and so we ended up being able to do an autopsy and showing what a thickened pleura would look like. Lung cancer related to asbestos is not, again, a new phenomena. In 1942, Wilhelm Uper, who was in charge of occupational cancer studies at the National Cancer Institute in the United States, published a book called Occupational Tumors and Allied Diseases. Everybody hoped they had an allied disease and not a cancer. And he said that asbestos caused lung cancer. And he listed all the kinds of products that were known in his book, which we've learned clearly were correct. But the first epidemiology was that of Sir Richard Dahl in Great Britain, who in 1955 looked at a textile factory where he expected 4% of the deaths to be due to lung cancer, and in fact got 17% of deaths. So we now had the epidemiology that showed that lung cancer was indeed related to exposure to asbestos. This might be a typical view of what a lung cancer might look like. Most lung cancers in smokers are in the upper part of the lungs, centrally located. Asbestos-related cancers can be anywhere in the lung, but they tend to move down in the lung and out to the periphery, those areas that have the greatest amount of asbestosis. Sometimes it's hard to differentiate a peripheral lung cancer from a mesothelioma. There have been difficulties in the past with regard to pathologists properly recognizing mesotheliomas. There are now new staining techniques that allow for a much better understanding of what truly is or is not a mesothelioma. There is a special relationship with cigarette smoking. This is data that Dr. Selikoff put together. If you don't smoke and you don't work with asbestos, you have a very low risk of developing lung cancer, but you can develop it even without these documented exposures. We'll take that as a rate of 1. If you work with asbestos but don't smoke, you have a 5 times increased risk of developing lung cancer. If you're an average 1-pack-a-day cigarette smoker, about 10 or 11-fold risk of developing a lung cancer. But if you work with both asbestos and are a smoker, it's not an additive risk, 5 plus 10, but the data shows that there's a multiplicative risk of about 50 in terms of developing lung cancer. So whenever I work with asbestos-exposed individuals, I very much stress, as I would with any one of my patients, about not smoking. This is a typical X-ray appearance of what a mesothelioma would look like. The most common presenting sign is shortness of breath. With an X-ray, the symptom is shortness of breath. The sign is fluid in the chest. This is, again, not unique to mesotheliomas, but this is quite common. This is what a mesothelioma might look like at an autopsy. Just encases the lung and it prevents it from expanding and taking oxygen in and out. And this is what a peritoneal mesothelioma might do to someone. This gentleman was an asbestos insulator with 3 bouts of benign asbestotic pleural effusion. So we were concerned about him over the years and developing cancer in his chest, and he ends up with a peritoneal mesothelioma. The ratio of lung cancers to mesotheliomas is not, as been reported by some people, to be 1 to 1. The best data shows that it's more like 2 to 1. Lung cancers to mesotheliomas, but in some studies they've gone as high as 6 to 1. So whatever number of mesotheliomas one has in any setting, the lung cancers related are going to be at least twice and maybe a bit more than that in terms of the lung cancers that could be related to prior exposure to asbestos. So one of my teachers at Mount Sinai, besides Dr. Selikoff, was Dr. Rabin. And in 1931, at the Mount Sinai Hospital in New York, he wrote a paper on the presence of a case of mesothelioma, which he put in the literature because it was such a rare disease. He went into the literature and found only 3 other cases that he could cite that had made its way into the literature. And one of our pathologists, Dr. Otani, said, no, there is no such thing as a mesothelioma. It's a variant of fibrosarcoma. And so for 30 years, these 2 clinicians had a friendly disagreement over, is there such a thing as a mesothelioma? And so they were carefully looked for at Mount Sinai, a hospital with 100,000 admissions per year. So in a decade, there'd be 1 million people. And then in the decade of the 30s, 40s, and 50s, there was exactly one mesothelioma every decade. So we have a baseline, at least in that setting and in many other settings that it has been looked at, of about 1 in a million, if there is such a thing. And if you look at the Harvard data, where they went back in their autopsy series into the 1800s, they had no mesotheliomas until the beginning of the 20th century, after asbestos had been used for 20 or more years. So it really was a very rare disease. By the time I was a student and a young trainee at Mount Sinai, we could have 5 or 6 mesotheliomas in the hospital at any one time. Now, it was a hospital. We collected them. They came for therapy. We were doing research on asbestos, but it was no longer an uncommon disease. In 1960, there was the report of Dr. Wagner in South Africa. He reported on 33 cases of mesothelioma that he saw in 4 years in the mining area of the Northwest Cape province, where there was a chrysotolite mine. What was interesting about that report was not only that mesothelioma could now be clearly related to exposure to asbestos, but he talked about a family member getting mesothelioma. There was a wife of one of the miners, and there was someone living in a village where the asbestos passed through on its way to market, who's simply living there, and we'll talk more about this in a bit later, who developed mesothelioma. So by 1960, we knew about familial exposure and what we would call neighborhood exposure. He then, for his troubles, was thrown out of South Africa. He was putting at risk the South African asbestos market, so he moved to Great Britain, and he started studying asbestos. And so he looked at the various fiber types, and if you look at the data here, you'll see that chrysotile caused just as many lung cancers as, let's say, chrysotolite, which some people claim is the most toxic form of asbestos. My own view on this is that it's an unsettled scientific question. There's no doubt that all fiber types cause all of the diseases, but the relative toxicity is really still unsettled. And as you see, he got just as many mesotheliomas with chrysotile as he did with chrysotolite. So this idea that chrysotile is the safe asbestos, don't believe it. He then asked, how much asbestos does it take to produce disease? And so he looked at animals. He did a long-term study, but some animals he only exposed for 1 day. And he got both lung cancers and mesotheliomas. It's not a perfect relationship, but there's clearly a dose response over time, where the longer he exposed the animals, the more disease he got. So then you could say, well, that's animals. What about people? There are known cases of 1-day exposure among humans leading to the development of mesothelioma. A case written up in England by Dr. Greenberg. Morris studied asbestos for many years over there, and he wrote of an individual who outdoors cut some asbestos boards in the backyard, built 2 backyard sheds, who 30 years later developed a mesothelioma. There are also a case of 2 sisters. This leads one to believe that there is, as we have learned, some genetic relationship to the development of mesothelioma, who during World War II in the United States, they were both college students, and during the summer break, they decided to help the war effort. They went to work in a shipyard, found it so dusty and dirty, they didn't return after the first day. And 30 or more years later, the 2 sisters each developed a mesothelioma. And there's a case out of Australia. A repairman goes into a factory where they were making asbestos products, worked on a piece of equipment for 6 hours, and 30 years later, he develops a mesothelioma. With regard to even less kinds of exposure, I had a case a number of years ago. But by way of transparency, I should share with you, I do a lot of medical legal work in the United States. I've been doing it for 40 years. I've never personally kept any of the money. I've always given whatever monies I might have earned to my universities. I've worked at 4 of them, 3 as a department head, and still do a very large number of medical legal cases every year. But this was one of the cases I worked at. There was a pipe running through a bathroom in a New York City apartment. A lady had lived in that apartment for many, many decades. The pipe wrap had started to deteriorate, and she ends up with that as their only known exposure and ends up developing a mesothelioma. It tells us how little exposure it takes. And anyone who goes around saying, you know, ripping out asbestos is not a hazard, you can do that and it's without any significant risk, I think is fooling people and is not supported by what we know about the hazards of asbestos. In terms of lung cancer, this is some work from a factory in New Jersey, where if people worked for a month or less, they doubled their risk of developing lung cancer. If they worked there for 2 years or more, they had a 7-fold increased risk of developing lung cancer working in the manufacture of an asbestos product. When does asbestos disease occur? If I would sprinkle everybody in this room today with a big cloud of asbestos, you're not going to get sick this week, next month, next year. Disease is going to start to show up after 10 years. There are a few exceptions to that, but there's sort of this 10-year rule that we work with. And the peak, however, doesn't occur till 35, 40, 45 years later when the disease starts showing up. Now, that sounds like a long time, but if you're an asbestos insulator who goes into the trade when you're 16 or 17 or 18 and you add 40 years to that, you're still relatively young when you're dying of your mesotheliomas and your lung cancers. Now, to this day, we still don't know what the exact mechanism is. We know that asbestos can cause genetic changes, but whereas we know for some substances, for radiation, for polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons, we know how the DNA gets changed. We don't know that for asbestos, but clearly there are genetic changes, and part of my earlier work was on the subject of trying to study and understand how that might occur, and I couldn't figure it out 50 years ago, and nobody still knows. So where does one get exposed to asbestos? What are the significant risk occupations? And you see a list here, by no means complete. Asbestos mining and milling, product manufacturing, insulation installers and construction people, shipbuilding and ship repair, many other settings in which people are exposed, railroads, especially in the steam era. You know, basically a steam locomotive was a boiler on wheels with 3 tons of asbestos wrapped around it. But you also have other exposures. You have household contact, we'll talk about some of those, consumer products, neighborhood contamination, demolition and waste disposal, transportation, and as you'll see, sprayed surfaces in public buildings. In the United States, some 700,000 buildings had sprayed asbestos, and we know that there are at least 25 million tons of asbestos in buildings in the United States that at some point we're going to have to deal with. So here's a typical asbestos insulation worker. He's a member of the union. He and his union brothers, there were no women for many years in that union, putting some asbestos cement on an elbow joint. So you're not surprised if he and fellow union members get disease. The spraying of asbestos material was started in Great Britain in 1932. By 1935, that process had come to the United States. And by 1970, more than half of all large multi-story buildings were sprayed with asbestos. A ban came in 1971. Some of you will recognize perhaps this building. This was one of the towers of the World Trade Center. The first one completed on the right, the second one under construction on the left. The ban came into place when 40 stories of the first tower had been sprayed with asbestos. And they used non-asbestos material thereafter. Here is, again, an asbestos insulator spraying asbestos on a steel beam. This was taken at the World Trade Center. And as you see, this is what the laborer had to come by and sweep up. This is what the electrician got exposed to. And this is what the brick mason was exposed to. So basically, everybody in the construction trades was exposed to asbestos, even if they weren't themselves directly handling asbestos. This is an example of, again, an asbestos worker dumping out asbestos cement. He's got a mask on. It's not a proper respirator. It isn't going to fully protect him. But if you look in the back right corner, you see a gentleman walking by. Who knows what he is? An electrician, carpenter, pipe fitter, who knows? he is what we call a bystander. So not only do people directly working with asbestos get exposed and end up with disease, but these bystanders do as well. This was a simple fix. The asbestos was now, the asbestos cement was put in plastic bags instead of paper bags. You could add the water into the plastic bag and dump out the wet material instead of creating clouds of dust like this. This is what the hold of a ship might look like, loaded with asbestos. A typical naval destroyer might have 40 tons of asbestos on there. So people who served in the Navy and people who built ships were at enormous risk of getting asbestos disease. This is a study from the Devonport Dockyard. Peter Harries did this study in Great Britain. He showed that of the 156 cases of disabling asbestosis, about a third of them were in the so-called sprayers and laggers, but the other trades got most of them. And with regard to the 55 mesotheliomas, only 2 were in sprayers and laggers, and all the rest were in people who worked in shipyards, but they themselves may not have worked with asbestos. When they studied the atmosphere in the holds of ships, they were up to 1,000 fibers per cc. About 1 million people in the United States do this kind of work, auto repair. This is done worldwide, and those were asbestos brakes that were being used and are still used in many parts of the world, including the United States. And you see there's a air monitoring device on his chest, and you can pick up asbestos fibers in his breathing zone. So we've talked about occupational exposures. Let's move on and talk about community exposure, consumer products, and the general environment. What you may recognize from an earlier view is that this is another mesothelioma. This was in a young man who at the age of 28 was found to have a pleural effusion. You don't think of a cancer in a 28-year-old, so finally, a few months later, they took some tissue out of his chest. He was found to have a pleural mesothelioma. The biopsy of his lungs showed that he had both chrysotile and amosite fibers in his lung, and he died just short of his 30th birthday. He had never worked with asbestos. He had been an accounting major at university, worked as a bookkeeper. But when getting a history of where he lived in New York City, he had been born and lived on Ross Street and later lived on Wilson Street. What you have, you see 2 little white dots to the right of the Brooklyn Navy Yard. That was Ross Street and Wilson Street. And he was exposed essentially from the time of his birth by asbestos drifting out of the shipyard into the local neighborhood. And we've also had a second mesothelioma I'm aware of across the street from the Navy Yard, and a gentleman working in a non-asbestos related shop as well. This is a picture taken in Ambler, Pennsylvania. It's about 30 minutes from where I work at Drexel University. It was known for a while as the asbestos capital of the world. They had numerous asbestos factories. They threw the waste material out, and there are 30-meter high piles of asbestos that the local children would play on. Not surprisingly, Ambler has a very high rate of mesothelioma. Those piles are now at least covered with some dirt and grass, but they're still sitting there with mounds of asbestos tailings that are there. Back at the London Hospital, the same place that Montague Murray worked, Molly Newhouse looked at all the cases of mesothelioma between 1910 and 1965. She found that about half the workers had industrial exposure. 9 were among relatives of people who worked in factories, so the material came home and exposed wives and children, been documented many times since. 11 lived within half a mile, and that's not unique to London. It's been documented in other settings. There was an asbestos cement plant in Cairo where they have the same problem, the Kubota plant in Japan. And when it says no known exposure, well, in 1910, the records didn't reflect that people were exposed to asbestos. Doctors weren't asking. I can tell you, I look at hundreds of medical charts a year for mesothelioma cases, and doctors still don't ask about exposure to asbestos. Again, this issue of how dangerous is it in small amounts. I showed you the factory data from the plant in New Jersey. Well, those workers brought material home, contaminated their homes, And there's a study, again, it's published, it's in the peer-reviewed literature, that individuals moving into a home where the asbestos worker had no longer been bringing material home, so just what was left in the house, 15% of either children born into that house or other people that moved into it would develop asbestosis simply from the household dust that had been brought in previously. So again, it does not take a lot of dust to cause disease. And mesotheliomas and lung cancers among wives, as I said, have been shown in England, the United States, Italy, Japan. So what about other kinds of neighborhood exposure? This is a study from Finland. County A had an asbestos mine. It was an anthophylite mine. They x-rayed about 6,300 people, and 499 had calcified pleural plaquing. County B, no mine, 7,000 x-rays, not a single calcified plaque. So it tells us that it gets out into the environment. This is a rock from a place appropriately called Rockville, Maryland. It's not far from Washington, D.C. They took out 1 billion cubic feet of rock. Those veins running through it are asbestos. And that rock was crushed and used for secondary roads in the area. Not so bad if you're in the first vehicle, but I'm not sure I want it to be in that second vehicle in the back. You could have seen that can in my office. Because of the wonderful collection that Tony Rich has, not only does he have photographs, but he has hundreds of products that contained asbestos. I shared this can with him, but asbestos ended up in 3, 4, maybe even 5,000 different consumer products over the years. This was one of the uses, the asbestos head. It was sold to be used in elementary schools for kids to make the asbestos head. And it was used for decorating your Christmas tree. As the Montgomery County Fire Department said, the county next to Washington, have a fire-safe Christmas. Use asbestos snow for decorating your trees. They actually sold this for that purpose. Then, of course, there's this abomination, crucidolite filters on cigarettes. For 4 years, Kent Cigarettes sold cigarettes with an asbestos filter. So you could have a puff of your carcinogen with every puff of your carcinogen. Now, I'm a physician. I've prescribed medications for people. No longer do they filter drugs with asbestos filters, but for years they did. And so I would be injecting asbestos either intravenously, intramuscularly into my patients without knowing it, because asbestos, as you see here, would be in those drug vials. Guess it's not the batteries. So, an underappreciated aspect of exposure to asbestos, we might talk about that later today, is this whole new issue of talcum powders. We have a big problem in the United States, but we're learning that it is a problem elsewhere in the world as well. This was the basement of the Mount Sinai Hospital. That's asbestos pipe wrap coming off the pipe, and I would go through this area literally every day between 2 buildings that I worked in. And they finally decided it was time to remove the asbestos. So they threw it on the back of a truck. They didn't cover it. They drove down to the end of the block, took a left turn. You're now driving down 5th Avenue, one of the major streets in the middle of Manhattan, on its way to the dump, with asbestos spewing out all over New York City. The truck wasn't very big, and so they had to store some of the asbestos between runs to the dump, and it was under the main air intake of the hospital. Now, this was at an institution where we were doing world-class research on asbestos, and the engineering staff at the hospital didn't appreciate the potential hazards of asbestos. So then I moved on to my next university. I was at the University of Kentucky. We had 400 buildings, many of them with asbestos. Here we see some deteriorating asbestos. Now things were different. So people were in moon suits, appropriately geared up. They had, the proper respirators. They used HEPA filters to clean up the ends of pipes. They put it in plastic bags. They used wetting methods. The water was then filtered before it went back out into commerce, because my drinking water downstream comes from upstream. We didn't want to put asbestos into somebody else's drinking water. They would do air measurements while the work was ongoing, put the asbestos in steel drums that were then buried in an appropriate toxic landfill. Okay. We're in a one-world marketplace now, Globot. We have to produce to the same high standards around the world. What about health and safety standards? That depends on what part of the world you work in. So here's a Chinese factory making asbestos brakes. That's a cotton gauze mask these ladies have as they grind the brakes. This is the textile part of the factory. Again, significant levels of exposure. And to finish up, this is a building and a view that many of you, I'm sure, have seen. The World Trade Center. I showed you a picture of the asbestos going in. This is the picture of the asbestos and a lot of other things coming out. The dust that settled in lower Manhattan, some of the dust had up to 4% asbestos in it, and we're starting to think that we're seeing some mesotheliomas in populations of responders that went there at the time. And here they were, desperately working to see if they could find people or bodies. So they were cutting up the steel beams, many of which had asbestos on them. What happened to those steel beams? They were sent to India and China to have the steel recycled. But they were sent with the asbestos still on them so that the Indian and Chinese workers could take it off, not to be sent the clean steel. So the legacies of the past are that we have projected death and disease. Even if we stop the use of asbestos today, everywhere in the world, there would still be disease for 50 or 60 years into the future. It still is widely used around the world. Engineering controls are not well developed. In America, we talk about regulatory feasibility instead of banning. It's not feasible to try to control it. We have lots of legal uncharted complexities, at least in the States and elsewhere. And as I said, there are 25 million tons still in place in America. So what we've learned that the pneumoconioses, including all of the asbestos-related diseases, are still best treated, if you will, by prevention. So thank you very much for your attention, and I think we have some time for questions.